Good morning, everyone. My name is Naomi, and I am a scientist at the MAP Center for Urban Health Solutions, which is a research institute at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto. And I'm also a nurse practitioner. And in both those roles, I work with young people experiencing homelessness. And I'm here today with Alexandra Amiri, who will introduce herself in a second. So thank you so much for coming to our presentation. We're going to spend a few minutes talking to you about our Transitioning Youth Out of Homelessness study. If I can advance my slides. We want to start with a land acknowledgement. So we want to acknowledge the land on which the MAP Center for Urban Health Solutions operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and Alex and I are very grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So just a bit of background before we get into the study. And if you want to know more, I have hyperlinked our study protocol below. But basically, there's not a lot of evidence of when people follow young people over time and look at social and economic inclusion outcomes. But those of us that have done that, the evidence honestly is a little bit disheartening in terms of social and economic inclusion outcomes. We see from large studies that like the Housing First at Home Chez Soi study, for example, that housing is a really important platform to stabilize young people. But when we look at outcomes beyond housing stability, we see that housing in and of itself is not a guaranteed springboard to social and economic inclusion. And so based on that, based on some work that I've done and the work of my colleagues, we came into this study with some assumptions, some kind of hunches. And our hypothesis was that young people exiting homelessness really need three forms of currency or capital to achieve social and economic inclusion. And two of them are external, so financial capital and social capital. And one of them is an internal resource or capital called identity capital. And so that became our research question. If we gave young people rent subsidies and mentorship, would they achieve social and economic inclusion? And that's really what we're setting out to understand. And so by rent subsidies, we're trying to tackle that financial capital piece, and mentorship, we were hoping to hit the social and identity capital piece. So what we did is we gave 24 young people rent subsidies. So just to be clear, everybody in the study got rent subsidies. The young people were from St. Catharines, from Hamilton, and from Toronto. And then they were randomly assigned a mentor or not. And so 13 of them were randomly assigned a mentor, and 11 of them did not get a mentor. And now I'm going to turn the presentation over to my colleague, Alexandra, who will take you from here.
Hi, everybody. I'm Alexandra. I'm a research coordinator with the Transitioning Youth Out of Homelessness project at St. Michael's Hospital. And today I'm going to talk to you about our quantitative outcomes. So looking at the slide here, we see our data collection time points. Our study started in March of 2019 when we first collected the baseline data. And our primary endpoint data was at 18 months. Currently, the intervention is in the post 6-month follow-up between 24 months and 30 months. Our intervention actually ended this past September 2021. And how we collected the data, so it was both questionnaires and interviews. So in terms of questionnaires, we followed up with our youth every 6 months, and we gave them surveys that were based on our quantitative measures. And Naomi met with the youth every 6 months as well to do a one-on-one interview. So I'm going to take you through our outcomes, which are from baseline to 18 months. Next slide. So here we have our demographic table. And if you take a look at age, we see that the average age was 22 years old across board. And in terms of gender, we had half of our youth identify as female, half identify as male. We did have the non-binary option, but no one identified as non-binary. In terms of race, the majority of our youth identified as white or Black, so that brings us to about 70%. The remaining 30% identified as Asian, Indigenous, or actually had a different choice. A little bit more than half of our youth indicated CAS involvement. And when we took a look at number of attempts to exit homelessness, about half of our youth indicated 1 to 2 attempts. And it's really interesting that about 30% of our youth indicated a greater number of 5 attempts to exit homelessness. So we can take a look at this table here, which shows our primary, secondary, and exploratory outcomes on the left-hand side, and the instruments that were picked to measure them on the right-hand side. So our focus today is reviewing the primary outcomes, which you can see are community integration and self-esteem, and our secondary outcomes of hope, enrollment in education, and employment. And on the right-hand side, you can see that the instruments that were chosen to measure them. So we actually call these proxy indicators, which basically means that since no scale currently measures socioeconomic inclusion, we decided to choose the community integration scale and the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, for example, as an indicator of socioeconomic inclusion. So for example, if self-esteem and community integration go up, it probably indicates that socioeconomic inclusion increased as well. Next slide. So this is our community integration scale, and there's actually two subscales. The first one is physical. You can see the range on the left-hand side is from 0 to 7. So higher scores indicate an increase in community integration. And on the bottom, you can see our time points. So 0 is baseline, and we have 6 months, 12 months, and 18 months. The blue line indicates our control group, so no mentorship, and the red dotted line indicates those who did receive a mentor. This is probably the scale that was most affected by the pandemic. We actually indicated that the lockdowns and COVID-19 started between our 6 and 12-month data collection, and you can see that the scores continue to decrease after that. So our control group actually scored slightly higher than those who received a mentor, but there were no differences between groups for this outcome. So if we look at our psychological scale, we actually see that those who did not receive a mentor, again indicated by the blue line, did a little slightly better than those who did receive a mentor. And there were no differences between groups in this outcome as well. And just as a reminder, higher scores for this psychological subscale indicate higher community integration as well. So our second primary outcome is self-esteem, and we use the Rosenberg self-esteem scale to measure. And if we look at both groups, we see that it's relatively stable over time. It's actually slightly increasing. Both groups stayed in the normal range of self-esteem over time. And again, those who didn't receive a mentor had slightly increase in scores. But for this outcome, there were no differences between groups. If we look at our hopelessness scale, so for this scale, the lower the score that you have, it's better, and it indicates more hopefulness for the future. And if we look at both groups, they actually stayed in the mild range over time, which is from 4 to 8. So for this group, actually, since lower scores are indicated as being better, those who did receive a mentor actually did better and performed better on this scale than those who didn't. But again, there was no differences between groups. So we actually combined information from education, employment, and training into one variable, which looks at whether youth are enrolled in school, are employed, or are in a skills training course. And we can see the changes by study groups. On the left-hand side, we have the mentorship, and on the right-hand side, we have the control. And if we take a look at the mentorship, for example, we can see that we can take a look at a snapshot at baseline, which shows us that 77% indicated yes to either education, employment, or training. And we can see that decrease at the 18-month snapshot to being 69%. We also see something similar in the control group. So 82% went down to 73% at 18 months. But it's important to remember that, for example, it may not be the same people saying yes over time. It could be a different number of people, for example, 9 people in the intervention. And it's also important to remember we did have a number of youth who lost their jobs during the pandemic, which could have affected the outcomes for this variable. So overall, we see stability, but no difference between study groups. And now I'm going to pass it over to Naomi to talk about our qualitative findings.
Thanks, Alex. That was great. Okay, so what I did, as Alex said, is I met, and I still am meeting, with 12 young people every 6 months. And so I'm going to take you through sort of the process that we saw young people go through as they exited homelessness. And it's really important to keep in mind that, we didn't know what the quantitative data was going to show, but we started to see really early on that there really didn't seem to be a difference between groups. So this applies to all of the young people that I followed, all 12 of them, whether they were in the mentorship group or not. So we start to see when we dig into the baseline interviews that we ended up calling it circling. So a lot of people talked about their past and all the inequities that they were faced with. And a lot of them spoke about the future seeming a bit foggy, kind of like looking through a foggy window. And for some of the young people, as I have met with them every 6 months, it feels a bit like they're trapped in this circling. And, when I chat with them, they seem like they feel a little bit powerless to change, and kind of resigned to where they're at. And again, kind of trapped in the circling. And when we do a deeper dive into the interviews that I've done to date with these young people, we can see that they really don't have much in terms of social connections. And also they are housed in part because they're getting rent subsidies from us, but that house does not feel like a home. A home is a different kind of thing, as we have learned in the study. Then there's other young people that I meet with, and you can see over time the fog kinds of lifts and they get some clarity. They seem more ambitious and more hopeful about the future, and they seem to sort of be able to break free from this circling. And when we do a deeper dive into those interview transcripts, we see a really important concept around connection. And so they have a really good sense of internal connection, so a really good understanding of themselves, and also lots of diverse external connections. So like maybe faith communities, family, school, education. And here they often will meet informal mentors. So we actually learned a lot about the importance of informal mentorship in this study. The other thing that we learned about was the difference between a house and a home. And so they helped us understand that, a home is more than just four walls and a roof. A home is a place where you feel physically and mentally safe. And that's what these young people described to us. So in terms of how we might intervene for the group that are sort of stuck circling, I think it's really to just try to mimic what we see above with the green line there, is just to give them some more diverse connections, including informal mentors, which are often, again, found in places like employment or education institutions. And again, the importance of identity capital. The young people that seemed to have more clarity really seemed to have a sense of having power over their life. And so just really chatting with a young person about having a sense of purpose, what is it that you want to do in life? Where do you want to go? And what are your goals? How are you going to get there? That would be important to chat with them about. And then finally, again, just even if they're housed, just to make sure that that house feels like a home to them, a place where they feel like they belong and a place where they feel safe. So that's what we are seeing qualitatively. And again, I'm still meeting with these young people, but that's what we're seeing now. So just to wrap up, in summary, as Alex pointed out, you can see that our quantitative outcomes were stable up to 18 months, which is something because, typically we see these outcomes get worse over time. So they were stable, but we were hoping to see a difference between groups. And in fact, we did not. But it's important to keep in mind that our outcomes are for sure confused or confounded by the pandemic. So the young people really didn't get that dose of mentorship we were hoping for. Mentorship had to switch to online, and a lot of young people that just didn't work for them. And then also, as I mentioned, qualitatively, we learned that a bunch of young people had informal mentors. So we had some young people in the control group, for example, that had some people in their life that served an informal mentorship role. So then that just made it really murky and really hard to see a difference between these two groups. And then as I summarize, the qualitative findings really showed us that young people that seem to be on that path to social and economic inclusion are more likely to feel at home, have more diverse connections, including informal mentors, and had a real sense of purpose and a sense of being in control of their life. So in terms of next steps for us, we are continuing to follow these young people. The study will wrap up in March. I'd like to do a deeper dive into this concept of identity capital. I still have a lot more to learn about it. And I think this is a really interesting concept, and it keeps coming up again and again for me. I would love to co-design an identity capital intervention with young people who've experienced homelessness as a next step. For those of you who are interested in identity capital, we actually offered an intervention a couple of years ago, and we just published a paper. I've hyperlinked it below there for you. And for that, we brought in an executive coach to do the identity capital intervention. So I'd like to draw on what we learned from her, but co-design with young people who've experienced homelessness. And so, my question still is, what's the secret sauce for helping young people achieve social and economic inclusion? And so as a next step, after we've co-designed an identity capital intervention, I would love to try this again, but have rent subsidies and then a co-designed identity capital intervention. And then I think the jury's out about the formal mentorship. Again, it was hard to assess during the pandemic, but we did see that informal mentorship seems to be really important for young people. So that's where my head is at these days. Just to wrap up, I want to acknowledge our fabulous community partners, the Raft in St. Catharines, Living Rock Ministries in Hamilton, and Covenant House in Toronto, as well as our funding partners. So thank you for listening to us, and we'd be happy to take some questions.